I want to start by saying how excited I am to be here to speak to you tonight, partly because about a year or so ago, my former employer, the city of Gainesville, Florida, issued an edict that said that Dom Nozzi shall not deliver these controversial speeches within 100 miles of the city of Gainesville. So I want to warn you that some of these views are perhaps rather dangerous and subversive. So I hope we're all ready for what I have to say tonight. Transportation delivers us, or is the beginning of, what our future will be in terms of sprawl and quality of life and environmental conservation for our communities. Okay, so when we establish our transportation plans and we lay our transportation system out in our community, we're essentially locking ourselves into a future of suburban sprawl or compact development. We're locking ourselves into a quality of life and a level of environmental conservation. It all starts with transportation. A lot of people will argue that transportation follows land uses, that transportation is trying to accommodate the land uses decided upon. I largely believe that that's a nonsense position, that it's very important for us to know that transportation typically drives and determines land use, quality of life, and environmental conservation. I hope to demonstrate that tonight. Okay, this is one example of how transportation really determines land uses. Okay, when you design a street for a modest speed, a low-speed street, 20 miles an hour, a shopping-type street, but a street where you're driving to rather than driving through, okay, a low-speed design street delivers a certain kind of character. You've got a relatively large field of vision as a motorist. What ends up happening is you're more attentive, you're driving more safely and carefully at lower speeds. Therefore, building ornamentation is more relevant. It's more to be expected on a low-speed street because it makes sense, because motorists are better able to see the ornamentation, so building ornamentation tends to be more common on low-speed street systems. Okay? And you also tend to have more pedestrian activity because pedestrians tend to enjoy the safer, calmer experience of a low-speed street. Okay? These are the kinds of things you can expect in a low speed. As we go to higher and higher speeds, we start seeing the field of vision shrink. Okay? Ultimately, at high design speed, 50 miles an hour, we start seeing what's called a cellscape. Okay? Now, increasingly, retailers along that street have to shout at us to get our attention because we're flying by so quickly. We only have a couple seconds to grab the attention of potential customers. That means that retailers are compelled to put in billboards, glaring lights, bright colors. It really doesn't matter too much what your regulations say, okay, in terms of controlling this kind of thing. Largely what's happening is that the design speed of the street is controlling what the character of the street is. Again, transportation determining land use. Again, transportation determining land use and things like regulations having very little impact over the character of your street. It really is all starting with transportation. I learned something very surprising a while back. About 100 years ago, developers were looked upon as gods. They were admired. They were heroes of our communities. Almost every time a developer came in and proposed new development in our community, there was great celebration. People were really looking forward to it, because almost always when new development came in about 100 years ago, or more perhaps, we knew that it was typically going to be improving our community. It was going to be helpful to our quality of life, and so developers were godlike. They were heroes for our communities. And we had scenes like this. When we developed, we see developers come in for a ribbon cutting. We had scenes like this. And many people from the community would come out to celebrate the great new building coming, right? You know, just a fantastic community outpouring of support for development. And of course, today, perhaps nothing can be more different. Developers are seen as evil black hats. They're bad guys. We have, in fact, are seeing the emergence of what I call a NIMBY epidemic. We have an epidemic of terminology we use to refer to people that don't like development in any way whatsoever. And so we have this growing number of terms that describe these kinds of people. And my personal favorite is the last one, okay? The last one is my personal favorite. So why on earth do we have this radical shift in how we look upon developers? They were godlike 100 years ago. Today, they're despised and feared and hated by many people in the community to the point where we had this epidemic. In my opinion, it's largely explained by this, okay? About 100 years ago, our design imperative was to design to make people happy. This was how we designed, to make people happy. That was our imperative. That's what we designed for primarily. Now, since then, over the past several decades, we've shifted our model. Now the design model says, we shall design to make cars happy first, okay? This is what we get. The commercial corridors, making cars happy, delivers us these Anywhere USA corridors that no one can be proud of. There's no civic pride here, okay? This is the outcome of designing to make cars happy, and I believe largely fuels this NIMBY epidemic because increasingly people can understandably expect that new development will deliver car-happy design, okay? Not design for making people happy, but car-happy design, which is almost always awful for any nearby neighborhoods, okay? What ends up happening as a result of this is that we think and see like motorists. We look at new development plans or site plans. We're thinking, how is this development going to be for my Ford? We're not thinking about how it's going to be for little Bobby and Susie. We're thinking about how it's going to be for our Chevy, right? That's our focus. It's a zero-sum game. Oftentimes we think, you know, we can have win-win strategies. We can make everyone happy with this development. But in fact, almost always when we build to make cars happy, every form of travel loses. You make cars travel easier, you're going to make transit more difficult, pedestrian more difficult, and bicycling more difficult. Economists call it the barrier effect. You create barriers almost always when you build to make easier car access or easier car travel. You create barriers for all other forms of travel. Okay, it's a zero-sum game. Cars win, other forms of travel lose almost always. A big problem we have as well is there are clashing values in terms of what we're looking for and what cars are looking for. Cars want to see radically different things than people. Cars want big, high-speed roads. They want big, massive asphalt parking lots. They want large spacing, big dispersal, big sprawl of community, low-density communities. Okay? People almost always look for the opposite of that. People want compact, modest, human-scaled spacing. They really dislike high-speed roads. They prefer low-speed, modest, narrow streets. Okay? That's what people are looking for. And so we have clashing values. The tragic dilemma that's emerged over the past several decades is that we are breeding car cheerleaders. Over time, more and more people, understandably so, because that's the only way you can get around is by car increasingly. We have people cheerleading for cars increasingly, people going to city council meetings demanding their elected officials make conditions better for cars. The unintended consequence is that we unintentionally worsen our quality of life because by making cars happier, we're actually unintentionally lowering our quality of life. Okay? So we have this terrible, tragic reality, this terrible, tragic dilemma of unintentionally hurting our own quality of life when we call for better conditions for our cars. So what ends up happening is that we are motorists first and business people second. We are motorists first and Republicans and Democrats second. We are motorists first and environmentalists second. Everything comes after the car when we're in a car-based society. Everything is second to the car in terms of what we do and what we are concerned about. And as I said, there are clashing values. Okay, clashing values. Here I'm going to show you an example of contrasting shopping experiences. This is the shopping experiences that cars look for. Okay, the classic car shopping experience. And then conversely, this is the experience we can expect when we design for shopping for people. A radically different vision, a radically different experience. Okay, car values are radically different than people values. Big differences in habitat design for the two. Clashing values. Now, my message is not all about getting rid of cars. People often think that that's the case. My point is not getting rid of cars. My point is that we need to stop pampering cars to the extent that they dominate our world. Okay? It's very easy for cars to dominate our world if we pamper them. We must avoid pampering them because they very quickly dominate our world. As I said earlier, they cause zero-sum problems. They create barriers to other forms of travel. They can very easily dominate our world. So this is a tradition, this is a design tradition for streets that we have largely abandoned. A more complete street where you accommodate all forms of travel. As you can see, we're accommodating transit, we're accommodating pedestrians, we're accommodating bicyclists. On-street parking is real for retail health, really healthy for pedestrian life. The buildings, as you can see, are behaving themselves. They're pulled up to they're butting up to the public sidewalk. They're forming an enclosed outdoor room. That kind of enclosure is a really pleasant experience for pedestrians. A sense of enclosure is really important. When you lose that enclosure with huge setbacks, buildings behind parking, for example, people feel exposed. It's a really unpleasant experience compared to the sense of enclosure you get with this human scale design in this street examples we're seeing here. And then, for example, again, contrastingly, this design, making cars happy, the Anywhere USA street design experience, a really great place for high-speeding cars, inattentive motorists, unsafe travel, buildings starting to turn their back on the public realm, the streets and sidewalks, pulling themselves back from it because the street's becoming more hostile. Great place for cars, really unpleasant place for people. You tend not to see pedestrians here. This is the experience we can expect from making cars happy as our design imperative that we've been involved in for the past several decades. So when we go to improve the car habitat, there are things that inevitably happen. Number one is that inevitably the people habitat declines, as I was saying. Number two, indirectly from that, or what follows from that, is that the wildlife habitat also declines. Because what happens is that you harm your people habitat in your cities. That increases the market interest and pressure on people wanting to leave the city and to live in more peripheral locations in the community. They want to escape the low quality of life. They want to live in the sprawling locations more so than in the past. And that means that we increasingly steamroll those real important wildlife habitat areas in the periphery of our communities. So what happens indirectly is that improving car habitat results in declining people habitat, which results in declining wildlife habitat. Inevitable process. This is not an image of a German city just after being bombed in World War II. Okay? This is a recent image of Houston, Texas. Life is great for cars in downtown Houston. There's plenty of parking, plenty of places to park your cars. There's plenty of affordable housing for cars in downtown Houston. You know, there was a German architect that famously said once that putting a parking lot in your downtown is the same thing as putting a toilet in the middle of your living room. And this image, I think, really gives us an example of that. It's really an awful place to be if you're a person. You know, who wants to live in a place that's essentially a lunar landscape parking lot for cars? I'm sure Houston's got a lot of people fleeing to outlying areas because the downtown has just become a place to be.